We're unmuted.
Ain't gonna start yet. Pushing it.
Watch out, vehicle on shoulder ahead.
Straight.
4 miles from the exit.
Well, yes.
It's an exit.
Well, good evening. Nice to see you all, and we'll get started in just a few minutes here. Some people were having a problem finding the email with the link. We were also, and just now came across it. So we'll wait just a few minutes here for more to join us, and then we'll launch right into our presentation for this evening. Well, good evening. Nice to see you all, and I assume others will be joining us, but we'll go ahead and begin here with a few announcements, and then open in prayer, and then we'll get directly into our presentation for this evening. And after the announcements by Millie Atkinson, we'll, as I said, open in prayer. And Wayman, I see you there on my screen, and if you would please open us in prayer in a couple of minutes. Thank you. All right. So Millie, good to see you and Paul. And what do we need to know for the upcoming week and month?
Well, I was trying to think of some good news. The good news is we just had a thunder shower, so we're thankful for the rain. The rest of the news is a little bit crazy. So anyway, I don't really have any specific announcements. I had a lot of information in the Watchman that went out last Tuesday, right before this session. So lots of resources there. I would just encourage you to check those out. I've just recently started listening to Elisa Childers. If you're not familiar with her, she wrote the book, Another Gospel. She has a great podcast, and she's really talking about the issues of the day. So that's a new resource I've recently found. But of course, a lot going on in the Methodist Church. And if you're not following that, or if you're not in Marietta and Mount Bethel, oh my, this subject tonight is so appropriate. Live not by lies. Not sure who's telling the truth or not here, but Satan and his minions are alive and well, is all I can say. And I did want to remind everyone, I know we're all friends of the Areopagus, and we so appreciate you, Jeffrey and Dolly, for what you do, and certainly these summer sessions that we can stimulate our minds, and we appreciate that. And I just, most of you know, probably all of you know, that the Areopagus is a faith-based ministry, and any gift that you would like to give to Jeffrey for this ministry, I'm sure he would be very grateful for. He is not supported by any church, which is probably a good thing in this day and age, Jeffrey, that you're independent and you serve by faith. So I will put your address in the chat if anyone would like to give. I know many of you all are faithful donors already, and just on behalf of Jeffrey and Dolly, it is greatly appreciated. So with that, I look forward to our evening. Eric, you're a great teacher, and I know it's going to be a great session. And then Wayman, thinking you're here. I don't see you on my screen, but if you will open us in prayer.
Before the prayer, if I can make one request, is there anyone here who has experience with hosting a Zoom session who would be willing to take it over from me so I don't have to worry about hosting and presenting at the same time?
Host? Yeah, I have hosted. What do you want me to, you mean like to let people in or something?
Yeah, just that sort of thing. Mute people if they're making noise or whatever.
Yeah, I had to do that with some like 5th and 6th graders last year. So.
All right, I'll switch host over to you then.
Okay. Be on your best behavior, please. I'd hate to have to mute you all.
All right. Well, thanks, Paul.
And
Wayman, why don't you open us in prayer, and we'll get directly into our study then for this evening.
Wait.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity in July for the summer session. Very timely book, Live Not by Lies. Every day we're just so frustrated.
Can you unmute?
Oops. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. We thank you for all the time the presenters this month take to prepare. We just ask that you prepare our hearts and minds and help us to take this material and somehow apply it to our lives. In Jesus' precious name, amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Wayman. And so this is the second in our series of 4 presentations on the book Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher. I started last week with a preface and an introduction, and we covered chapters 1 and 2 last week. Tonight, Eric Smith will be leading us in chapters 3 and 4. By the way, next week, Larry Keener will be presenting chapters 5, 6, and 7, and then we'll finish up the following week, which is July 27th, with chapters 8, 9, 10 in the conclusion, and George Weaver will be doing that presentation for us. So thanks for joining us for this series. It's an extremely important, valuable book, and hopefully you've been able to read at least some into the book, an awful lot of content there. But just to introduce Eric, he's a physics professor at Georgia Military College. Many of you are familiar with Eric, of course. He and his wife, Andrea, have been involved in the ministry of the Areopagus for probably about 10 years now. And Eric also supervises our Facebook postings. Andrea handles our communications and publications. So they're a very valuable part of our ministry, and we appreciate them very much. I wanted to start with just a very brief 3 or 4 minute review of a couple of points from last week, and then I'll turn it over to Eric for the remainder of our time. But I will do this by way of PowerPoint. So let me open that up and okay. All right. Now, those of you who joined us last week, oh, excuse me here, let me, all right. Those of you who joined us last week, remember we started with about a 20 or 30 minute overview of why it's so important to have basically a preface to a book like this. And we talked about some of the necessary aspects in order to have a fruitful discussion. So Rod Dreher, most of you are familiar with, the author of our book, Live Not by Lies. 3 years ago, he wrote another book called The Benedict Option, which was extremely important. One of the most important, I believe, Christian books of the last 10 years or so. And I had started, or part of my presentation last week was this graph of political orientations, 2 alternative models. And I realized as I was presenting it that I had actually loaded on my PowerPoint presentation the wrong graph. And so I wanted to amend that. This one makes considerably more sense, and just very briefly, as we reviewed last week, there is kind of a standard linear model for assessing various political points of view. And this standard model, which is what is presented in the media all the time and typically in academia as well, is this linear model where you have on the extreme left extreme Marxism and communism, then moving a little bit more toward the center of the scale is socialism. Then we come to sort of the centrist view, which is liberalism or kind of a moderate political orientation. Then we go into the right wing category with conservatism, libertarianism, and then a far right ideology supposedly is Nazism or fascism. And as we mentioned last week, this kind of a model, which is the standard model, really makes no sense whatsoever, because what really matters is the degree of government control over our lives. And so you see in this model, on the far left, a totalitarian ideology is Marxism and communism. But then on the far right is also a totalitarian ideology, Nazism and fascism. And so, as I said, those are not polar opposites. They're very similar, actually. And so a much preferred model would be a revised 2-dimensional model, as you see here. And if you go down to the lower left-hand corner, you find that as far as government control of the economy and government control of our lives in most every aspect, government control of society and culture, including moral issues, aesthetic issues, art, religion, public policy issues. In the far in the bottom left-hand corner, you find very minimal government, and this is where you would find, for instance, anarchism. Well, anarchism, as you know, is actually no government at all. It's an absence of government, and that's always merely a temporary situation. It will be replaced by some sort of government very quickly. And so libertarianism is a minimalist approach to government in terms of the government's ability to control the economy and also our private lives and our public lives in most respects. Now, the original US constitutional republic was fairly libertarian in its orientation. But the reason for that is that America had a very rich tradition of Christian influence and moral influence in our founding, as you know. And of course, the more virtuous people are, the less need there is for government interference or government control over our lives. But the more irresponsible and the less virtuous people become in a society, this provides an opportunity for government to move in and want to control certain areas of our life, both primarily publicly, but also personally as well. Now, contemporary conservatism, you see, moves up the scale. It calls for a little more government control over the economy. And also, depending on the issues that we're referring to, conservatism calls for a little more government control over our social and cultural life as well. Now, further up the scale, we have modern liberalism, which calls for more government control of our lives, both in terms of our economic lives and social and cultural lives as well. Even more government control moves us into the realm of socialism. And then beyond that, we really are into the realm of totalitarian political philosophies, fascism, Nazism, and Marxism and communism. And there always have been some variations between, for instance, Nazism and communism, obviously, but they're far more similar than they are dissimilar. They're both totalitarian systems. So again, by way of explanation, like I said, I had accidentally imported an older and different version of this graph last week. And then we started with these three issues. If we're going to have any kind of productive interaction with others when it comes to social, political, cultural, and also spiritual issues, there's three issues that are of paramount importance. Number one is American culture becoming progressively better or worse. Now, for most of us, perhaps all of us in this class, we would consider that to be a no-brainer, to say the least. Is American culture becoming better or worse? Well, we see an incredible amount of cultural deterioration and collapse all around us. It's in the news every day. But there are those, of course, who would argue otherwise, that no, in fact, America and American culture is becoming better because look, every year and every decade, our technology gets more sophisticated, including medical technology and so on. And so in their minds, the trends that we see are actually generally for the better. But most of us, probably all of us, would strongly disagree. Secondly, is there a culture war going on in America? And this is something that even a lot of conservatives and a lot of church leaders are in total denial of. But I think as we presented the evidence last week, this is in fact undeniable, an undeniable reality. There is a ferocious culture war going on in American society. It's getting more and more intense all the time as the secular left becomes increasingly authoritarian and totalitarian in its orientation. And then thirdly, is true Christianity countercultural? And last week I made the case that in fact true Christianity is and always has been innately countercultural. And there's so much in Scripture that warns us about accepting and adopting the standard beliefs and practices and priorities of our society and culture, or as we're told in the New Testament, the ways of the world. And then lastly, is there a culture war in America? When you think about this progressive agenda, whether it's disguised as, quote, liberalism or socialism or neo-Marxism, whatever the term is, essentially this is all about secularizing America. In other words, marginalizing God and certainly renouncing anything related to the Christian faith. So secularism is a major aspect of this. They want to sexualize everything. They even want to sexualize our children and grandchildren in elementary school and on up. It's just incredibly shocking and shameful. They want to racialize everything. That's the whole essence of critical race theory, is setting the races against one another. The basic core concept of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, as articulated by Martin Luther King Jr., was that people need to be judged and assessed on the basis of the quality of their character, not the color of their skin. Critical race theory absolutely reverses that. So it's an attempt to racialize our society and culture, set the races in opposition to one another. It's also a socialist agenda, as we've talked about. And furthermore, they want to politicize everything as well. So again, just by way of brief review, some of the major points we addressed last week. And with that, let me opt out of that and turn things over to Eric and his presentation for this evening. So Eric, good to have you with us and certainly looking forward to it.
Okay, so got a lot to go over tonight, so I will ask people to hold questions and comments and the like for the end. So I am going to be looking at chapters 3 and 4 of Live Not by Lies. Chapter 3 is progressivism as religion. So progressivism as such isn't just a political movement. In this chapter, we're going to look at how it really fulfills all the requirements for a religion. And pretty much any religion needs some kind of foundational myth, a foundational idea, which is the sort of story that religion tells to make sense of the world. And the myth of progressivism is, not surprisingly, the myth of progress. And the myth of progress says that the present is better than the past, and that the future will be better than the present. And this is the foundational assumption that what we have now, that basically history is always improving things, that there is nothing we have now that's worse than what we had in the past, and there will be nothing in the future that's worse than what we have in the present. And totalitarians will use this myth to justify their actions. Basically, it's an ends justify the means kind of deal, that if we are marching towards utopia, any action that furthers that hastens society's advancement toward what's better is justified then, even if they seem to be horrible actions, because ultimately we're looking for a better future. And they also use this to paint their opponents as being backwards and ignorant, because if you're in favor of progress, which according to the myth of progress is an absolute good. If you're a conservative and therefore by definition in opposition to mindless progress, then you must be backwards or ignorant. And at the very best, you need re-education. And if you can't be re-educated, then you just need to be removed in order to make way for society move forward. And this is the heart of the Marxist dialectic. If you're familiar with the whole idea of the dialectic, where you have two opposing forces that clash and form something new, this was Marx's whole idea, that in society there are always two opposing forces and they clash and they form basically a new kind of society that's better than what came before. And then you have more clashes, and with every clash, society progresses. So that idea was at the heart of Marx's scientific socialism, as he called it. And nowadays, it tends to get expressed as being, in quote, the right side of history. You know, it's a very common phrase to hear nowadays. We want to be on the right side of history. And that very phrase presumes that there is a right side to history, that history is going someplace. Where history is going is good, and we want to be with history as it goes forward. We don't want to be trying to resist that. And so the left, or Marxism, or progressivism, however you really want to call it, is defined by this belief that humanity is on this grand march toward progress, progress sort of with a capital P, that it's almost this force in and of itself. And to resist it and to resist them is to stand against the future, and therefore the ends will justify the means. So this is the myth of progress. This is the underlying ideology behind progressivism as more sort of a religion. However, we don't want to think that this is an idea completely confined to the left, because many American conservatives will also believe in this. This myth of progress is really part of the American culture as a whole. It's sort of baked into our DNA as a country, which isn't surprising given our history. We see our history as one of constant improvement, from small, powerless colonies to expansion to being the greatest country on earth, so to speak. And so our own history as a country would seem to be a progression from worse to better. And so this has become part of not just the left's idea, but really of American culture as a whole. The only real difference between the conservative myth of progress and the more leftist or progressivist myth of progress is what is society being progressed towards, and what's the role of the state in such progression. Will we progress better if the state takes control and guides, or will we progress better if the state stays hands off and lets society go on its own? Now, obviously, the idea that history ultimately has a positive end, a purpose, is a very Christian idea. Teleology, the idea of an end, a purpose to history, is what sets Christianity, and before it Judaism, apart from all the pagan religions around it. So this belief in the ultimate triumph of good is a part of Christianity, but Christians have to realize that progress without God isn't progress at all, that history just left to itself is not going to get better and better necessarily. If you've ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, there's a scene in Dawn Treader where the governor of the Lone Islands is telling Caspian, "How dare you come in and make us give up our slaves? And don't you have any idea of progress of the march of society?" And Caspian says, "I've seen it before in Narnia. It's when it happens in an egg, we call it going bad." And so we have to realize that progress without God isn't growth, it's going bad, it's rotting. But the progressivists of the left, and even a lot of conservatives as well, will believe that any progress pretty much is good progress. So where did this myth start? Well, it starts back in the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment sought to replace faith in God with faith in man, science, and technology. And it formed its own philosophy known as positivism. So the myth of progress is an outgrowth of Enlightenment positivism. And positivism taught that history was the story of the advancement of science and technology. And that science and technology would eventually end all suffering and produce a greater science-based morality. And it would be a greater morality because it would be based in science and not based in religion. And these Enlightenment ideas were as much a part of the founding of America and American culture as Christianity. So the American dream started out at least somewhat religious, certainly not completely religious, but motivation of many of the original colonists was a religious one, but it has changed to positivism. Basically, instead of using freedom to pursue virtue, which was the old definition, we now use freedom to pursue pleasure. And this is seen as society advancing. So this is the myth of progress. This is the underlying idea, the underlying worldview of progressivism, not just as a political ideology, but as a religion. So let's look at a bit more of its characteristics as religion. So for conservatives, or what you might call classical liberals, because classical liberals really are more like what we would today call conservatives. For classical liberals, the ideal society is one in which everyone has equal freedom of choice. However, for radical liberals, what we would see nowadays as the left or as progressivists or Marxist, the ideal society is one in which everyone has equal outcome. Basically, this boils down to equality versus equity. And those are two terms that are getting bandied about a lot in the last year or so. Equality is being denigrated, it's being pushed down, and equity, the equal outcome, is being promoted. Where it's no longer about everyone gets the same chance, it is now about everyone has to have the same result. Now, to Marx and his followers, this progress, this idea of equity, was going to create a heaven on earth. That was the ultimate goal of progressivism, of positivism, of communism, this heaven on earth. And because of that, any heaven promised by religion was a lie. It was a distraction. It was something that had to be removed from the hearts of the people so they could accept the idea of heaven and earth, of an earthly utopia that they needed to be fighting for. And the promise of this heaven on earth allowed progressivism to fulfill the religious longings of people. Everyone has a longing for heaven. Everyone believes that this world should be better than it is. Christianity and other religions offer their answers to this longing, their ways of filling it. Progressivism gives its own. And in this way, progressivism is very much a religion. It is fulfilling the longing for religion that people have inside of them by promising this heaven on earth. But again, in order to establish this new religion and to bring about the utopia, Christianity especially has to be routed, has to be rooted out as a false religion, as a false promise of heaven. Because if people believe that heaven is coming in a next world, they won't be fanatically devoted to bringing about heaven in this world. So progressivism satisfies the same longings that religion does in a lot of ways. And because of that, its most devoted followers are willing to die for it. They are willing to kill for it. Basically, it provides a sense of purpose. It provides a sense of community. And it has its own martyrs. It has its own exiles. It has its own, people who are being elevated to revered status for everything they sacrificed for it. So again, this is filling in all the slots that would normally be filled in by what you would see as a more traditional religion. And of course, the goal of this is some type of totalitarianism. Jeff talked about the differences between hard and soft totalitarianism last time. And under soft totalitarianism, any thought or behavior that is hostile to this religion, if it excludes members of the group favored by the religion of progressivism, it's subject to harsh condemnation. Interestingly, however, this official doctrine that cannot be gainsaid, the official doctrine of progressivism, is not really so much imposed from above in soft totalitarianism. Rather, it arises from left-wing consensus from below. It arises basically from the mob. Instead of being decided by, a few elites, it's worked out through more social processes. And it's enforced by witch hunting and by scapegoating. Anyone who dissents to the progressive gospel, they are silenced through things like loss of employment or by fabricated accusations of various thought crimes. Or, since we're referring to this in religious terms, instead of thought crimes, we can really think of any dissent to progressivism as heresy. Because, again, that is the role that it fills here in this more religious context. People who oppose progressivist ideology are heretics. And by their nature, then, heresies make accusation and guilt the same thing, much like it was in things like the Salem witch trials. You're accused of something, you might as well be guilty of it. You'll be treated as though you are guilty of it, even if later on it might be proved that you weren't. Furthermore, new heresies, new thought crimes are being constantly invented. And this is necessary so you have ways to trap these so-called enemies of the people. Because progressivism has, as part of its worldview, the idea that it will always be opposed by the ignorant and the backward. So it needs to have enemies of the people to struggle against. That's the idea, that we are struggling toward progress. And so in order to always have new enemies, you have to continually create new heresies that formerly, completely pure people can now fall prey to. And furthermore, they can't be defended against because no one really knows what they are, because they're constantly being, newly invented. Before, we've had homophobia, we've had Islamophobia. Nowadays, you have things like fat phobia or gay phobia, or all these every new quote unquote phobia coming out of the woodwork now, because you need to have a continual progression, transphobia, all these other things. You have to have this continual progression to create new enemies of the people. But since all these new accusations are just that new, no one really knows what they are. No one can really prove them, but there's no need to prove them. The accusation is enough. And therefore, the reach of contemporary thought crime, of heresy, widens constantly. That's why you're always hearing about people in the news getting in trouble over a tweet they made a decade ago, which at the time everyone was fine with, but now is found to be problematic in some new way. So the reach of heresy widens constantly. No one can ever feel safe. To be safe, you have to constantly be affirming every new doctrine of the progressive religion. Furthermore, one can be assumed guilty of heresy based purely on class or social status. Even if they haven't done anything in particular, people of a certain social status, people of a certain class or identity group are just automatically guilty to begin with. So there is a never-ending supply of enemies for the progressivists to struggle against, so they can maintain their myth of progress and this sense of community, their sense of themselves being martyrs. That ties them together. So the most recent form that progressivism has taken is the idea of quote unquote social justice. And Jeff talked a bit last time about social justice warriors, SJWs, basically people who are always on the alert to finger the new heretic, to find the new thought crime. And these people actually play a very similar role in modern society that the Bolsheviks did in Imperial Russia. They're always, again, searching for new enemies. And it's not hard to find because it is a religion. Social justice depends on axiomatic claims that cannot be proven. You can only accept these claims as revealed truth. Think of, anytime you read something by someone from critical race theory, it is taken as a given that society is systematically racist, that whiteness is evil. They don't feel the need to prove it. These are revealed truths. And the upshot of that is that it's impossible to have logical debate. You cannot apply, facts, reason, logic, because these axiomatic claims are inherently and sometimes very proudly irrational. Now, many times social justice people will talk about having a dialogue, a continuous dialogue. But dialogue is really, for them, just a code word for, you shut up and listen to me and confess your sins and submit. There's no equal exchange of ideas. And social justice people are not moral relativists. I feel like, I've seen this a lot. It seems like most Christian apologists are stuck on the moral relativism, but the current generation has moved beyond that. They're no longer moral relativists. They're very rigid moralists, and they have a very deep concern for purity. You must be ideologically pure in all aspects. So what does it mean to be ideologically pure? Well, we need to look at the basic creeds of social justice then. What is the core of what they believe? What are these revealed truths that are accepted as axiomatic? And the first one is that the central fact of human existence is power. So everything in life is understood through power relationships. Everything people do, they do as a means of gaining and keeping power. There is no real such thing as love. There is no such thing as truth. You do something not because you believe it to be correct. You do something because it gets you more power. And ultimately, they believe that power is everything. This is, of course, similar to Marx's idea. To Marx, economics was everything. But the neo-Marxism, the new social justice, power is everything. And social justice, therefore, as they see it, is the mission of reordering society to create more equitable power relationships. However, even though they will claim that is their goal, they will also claim that you can never have truly equitable relationships. And any time two people interact, there will always be an oppressor, the one with more power, and there will always be an oppressed, one with less power. And their interactions cannot be made in any basis other than on power. And power is automatically assumed to be bad. If you have power, you are automatically assumed to use it for the purpose of oppression. So they may claim to want more equitable relationships, but their own philosophy will tell them that that's not possible. So ultimately, what they're really after isn't equitable, it's just basically turning the tables. The oppressed become the oppressors. But because they claim that they're simply after more equitable relationships, they can therefore label those who oppose them as practicing, quote, hate. And because they are hateful, they have to be conquered. You can't reason with hate. You can't tolerate hate. You have to eliminate hate. And that can be done either by, convincing the person to give up their hate or just by eliminating the person. So this is the first revealed truth. The central fact of all human existence, all human relationships is power. Everything else is illusion. And a corollary to that is that there is no such thing as objective truth. There is only power. To them, true and false is simply what's stated to be true and false by those in power. And therefore, all truth claims are merely veils concealing the will to power. Christians don't say things like abortion is wrong and, sexual immorality is wrong because we really believe it to be wrong. From this point of view, we say those things because it gives us a measure of control over the other person. It is a means of exercising our power. And so what is true, what is false is not absolute. It is simply an expression of the power of the oppressors, which means that basically any other explanation is simply a rationalization for oppressors to hold and maintain power over the oppressed. And it also means that the value of any truth claims depends on who is making them. If the one in power is making a claim to truth, it can be discarded because the only reason he's making that claim to truth is because he is seeking power. However, if an oppressed person makes a true claim, it can be seen as unvarnished truth because they do not have power to exercise. Therefore, their expression of truth is actually real. So by being the oppressed, they automatically have special access to truth, and they must be believed unquestioningly. So how do we know who is oppressed and oppressor? Well, that's what we learn from identity politics. Basically, your level of oppression or your level of being an oppressor is determined by what groups you belong to. It really has nothing to do with you. It doesn't really depend on anything you do or don't do. It totally depends on what group you belong to. And there are many, many types of groups. There are groups based on sex and or gender because, of course, in modern society, those are seen as two separate things. Your group is determined by your religion. Your group is determined by your orientations and the like. So if you're white, male, heterosexual, and Christian, you are an oppressor. These are the groups that hold power in our society, and because they hold power, they are by definition using that power to oppress others. On the other hand, the oppressed are racial minorities, they're women, sexual minorities, and religious minorities. If you are a woman, if you're Black, if you're a Muslim or an atheist, if you're transsexual, you are in an oppressed group. You do not hold the power in society, so therefore, by definition, you are oppressed. It is interesting to note that the old Marxist view would have had the poor as the oppressed class, but being poor in neo-Marxism actually ranks fairly low on the list of the oppressed. Just being poor by itself, you're not that oppressed. If you're a poor white male heterosexual Christian, you're still considered an oppressor. On the other hand, if you're, say, a incredibly wealthy Black female, you are oppressed. You may be a multimillionaire, famous actress, comedian, whatever, but you're still oppressed because you belong to these oppressed groups. And, just ask any actress in Hollywood if they're oppressed by, the males, even if they, make millions of dollars a year. So power, oppression, or oppressor is determined solely by your identity group. It doesn't really have anything to do with your actions personally. And social justice, therefore, is working out what is rightly due to a person based on their group identity. So how do you determine your level of oppression, your oppression score, so to speak? Well, you do that by intersectionality. Basically, everyone is a member of multiple identity groups, and all of these identity groups overlap in you. And the more oppressed identity groups you belong to, the more oppressed you therefore are. And so oppressed group identities are linked together through this idea of intersectionality. And even though many of these identities are very different, they nonetheless are seen as all having a common enemy, and therefore a common goal, and therefore all the oppressed identities are expected to band together and to challenge the powerful as a united front. Now, if you are a member of a privileged oppressor class, you are allowed to become, quote, an ally, which basically means you sit back, you shut up, and you do and believe whatever the oppressed groups tell you to do and believe. You cannot question any tenet of these social justice creeds. And if you do that, you can be counted an ally. You may still be an oppressor, but you're not as bad as the others. Lastly, they believe that language creates human realities. And this is where it gets really postmodern. If you're familiar with the original literary theory forms of postmodernism, this is where this comes out of. Basically, human nature is seen to be constructed largely through the use of linguistic conventions, which means that speech itself is a form of violence. If your speech is offensive, if your speech is contradictory to the creeds of social justice, that is no different than actual physical violence, because human identities, human reality is shaped by speech. And because of that, the subjective beliefs of the oppressed classes are therefore seen as uncontestable knowledge. And to disagree with them is an attack not on their ideas, but on their very identity. You can't say to someone, well, are you really oppressed? Give me a concrete example of being oppressed by you questioning their beliefs. You are committing an attack on them. And again, that makes logical and dispassionate debate not possible, because it means you can never disagree with an oppressed group, which means you can never truly have an honest discussion. So these are the revealed truths of social justice as religion. So how does this relate to Christianity? Well, as I said before, the basic idea of social justice has its roots in Christianity. It has its roots in the Christian idea that we have the duty to work towards the common good, and that common good is defined as an environment that allows all people to live up to their dignity as creatures made in God's image. We want to create an environment where everyone can be virtuous, that we can act more like God. However, the social justice of progressivism has been removed from that Christian context and has therefore become perverted. Of course, Christian views are based on the idea that all people are sinners. All have sinned. We have all fallen short of God's glory. We are all equally lost. Secular social justice, on the other hand, will determine your level of sinfulness, again, by your identity group. If you are in a powerful group, if you are in an oppressor group, you are by definition sinful. If you are in an oppressed group, you are by definition morally superior. So again, it all comes back to that idea of group identity. Your level of sinfulness is determined not on your actions, but simply on what group you're a part of. Now, because all of this originally arose out of Christianity, Christian terms can still be used to express it. And because of that, a lot of these ideas have started to infiltrate churches. I've been in churches where I've heard, speakers talk about how Jesus came to upend the social order and challenge power structures and the like. And these people will attempt to apply identity politics and categories to the church using Christian language. And a lot of times this is done under the code word of decolonization. They'll say things like, we need to decolonize our worship or decolonize our theology. In other words, we need to remove any influence that, white male heterosexual culture has had and allow the oppressed groups to more or less take over our expressions of Christianity. And that is decolonization. And again, that's how it's expressed. But again, a lot of times that is simply code word for bringing in progressive ideals into the church. And so Christians have to resist this. And to resist this, we have to do something we may not realize that we need to do. And that is, we need to discard the myth of progress. The myth of progress is not Christian, but it is so much a part of our culture, of the American culture that many Christians love. Many Christians very patriotic. And so they tend to unthinkingly absorb the so-called American dream. And they do this uncritically. But this myth of progress is part of that. And the myth of progress is ultimately unchristian. So we have to get rid of this idea that progress, human progress, is always good. But we have to retain hope in the future. But our hope in the future lies in God. It doesn't lie in any human social movement. So this is chapter 3. The idea of the progressivism as religion. Now in chapter 4, we're going to shift gears somewhat. We're going to look at a current outlet of progressivism that many people wouldn't expect, and that is capitalism. Capitalism has now become woke. It has become progressive. And the modern form of capitalism, the danger of capitalism lies in the idea that information is power. Remember the title of this book, what Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, Live Not by Lies, meaning you should never, in any of your actions, in any of your speech, agree with or even silently condone that which is not true. But in order to speak the truth, you have to have an inviolable zone of privacy. In order to feel comfortable to speak truth, you have to know that you are safe speaking it, which means you have to have some part of your life that is not infiltrated by forces around you. This is why surveillance was so crucial to maintaining the tyranny of the communist bloc. Why, you know, groups like the KGB and the Stasi were so intent on bugging and monitoring all of their citizens, because they wanted to destroy this zone of privacy to prevent any speaking of truth. Now, ultimately, their goal was to make that active surveillance unnecessary by developing what they called the socialist personality. And the socialist personality was one where snitching on your neighbors was normalized, or everybody was watching everybody else for the slightest indication that they were not fully devoted to communist and socialist ideology. They wanted a personality that perceived privacy as a harmful thing, that privacy was something to be avoided, that it was dangerous to society as a whole. This was the ultimate goal of communist countries. Now, in order to achieve this level of surveillance, you had to build a fairly extensive surveillance network. But nowadays, this complex network no longer needs to be built. We have now invited it into our homes in the form of technology and social media. So instead of the socialist personality, we now have the social media personality, in which privacy isn't just considered harmful, it's considered almost unthinkable. They can't understand why you would bother with privacy at all. Your life is to be lived on social media. It is to be lived in the view of everyone around you. And by doing so, they have created a far more extensive surveillance network than Russia or East Germany could ever have imagined. And how did this come about? Well, it came about due to the rise of woke capitalism. Now, traditionally, American conservatives have seen the state as big government. And they have seen corporations, big business, as the natural enemy, the natural bulwark against big government. And because of that, they were willing to allow big business many freedoms, many allowances that they otherwise would not have been comfortable with, because they saw big business as standing in the way of big government. However, after the Cold War ended, and the market became more globalized, even liberal politicians were converted over to support of business, to the support of global mega corporations. And this has led to a vast expansion of corporate power, because only the most radical leftists are now standing against it. So you now have these mega corporations that are more richer, more powerful than many countries. 5 of them in particular: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, which together have a nearly incalculable influence over our modern life, both our public life and our private life. They regulate our entire contact virtually with the world around us. But as big business was accepted by the left, it has therefore moved steadily leftward on social issues. Maybe not always on financial issues, because it is not in their interest to do so, but certainly in terms of social issues, big business is now almost universally woke. And if you're not familiar with that term, to be woke simply means to be in complete agreement with the tenets of social justice and progressivism. And that is where big business stands now. And it has used that clout to forward these charges, to forward these causes. In the past, of course, businesses will usually try to stay out of politics, because they knew that if they sort of waded into that arena, they risked alienating a large portion of their consumer base. But that started to change in 2015. In 2015, a coalition of corporate leaders threatened economic retaliation against the state of Indiana. Basically said, we will pull out of your state, we will not do business with your state, because it had passed a bill that would have given some protections to businesses sued for supposed anti-gay discrimination. You know, refusing to bake a cake or supply flowers or photograph things like gay weddings. So Indiana passed a bill that would have protected that. And so now you have big business coming forward and saying, you know, if you don't rescind this, we are going to take action and we are going to crush you economically. And unfortunately, they won. And they won, and they didn't really get any reprisals. You know, conservatives get mad, but, you know, we don't change our behaviors that much. So that has opened the door to these large corporations and are starting to increasingly lean on these state governments to pass pro-LGBT legislation, to resist religious liberty laws and the like. Furthermore, these companies are only going to move further to the left. You know, you've heard the statement, I'm sure, you know, if you're a liberal when you're under 30, you don't have a heart. If you're liberal when you're if you're not conservative when you're over 30, you don't have a brain, that sort of thing. It was always assumed that when college students graduated and got exposure to the real world, they would leave their radicalism behind and become more conservative minded. That is no longer the expectation. Nowadays, on the other hand, college students are expected and they are taught and encouraged to bring their activism with them out of college into the business world. Their goal is to create corporate social responsibility. Basically, they want to take these social justice ideals out of the classroom and into the business world. And this is often done in the form of companies having, quote, diversity departments, which exists mainly to force employees to embrace progressive causes for fear of losing their livelihoods. They will force employees to participate in gay pride events or to support transsexual awareness or all these things, or to support, critical race theory in their business. These are enforced by these diversity departments. So this woke capitalism really is the most potent element of social change in modern society. It dwarfs what the government does because its reach, its influence is far more insidious. It's not as blatantly obvious, and conservatives aren't looking for it. Too many conservatives are still expecting business to be on their side. But woke capitalism is marrying progressive ideology with the American obsession with consumerism. Basically, millennials and Gen Z customers are seeing their consumer purchases as part of their virtue signaling. They are using their purchases to create their own socially conscious personal brand identity. In the social media world, you're not really putting your true self out there. You're putting a constructed brand. You are a brand that you are basically selling to the world on social media. And to millennials and Gen Zs, it's very important that that brand be seen as progressive, that it be seen as socially conscious. And their consumer purchases are designed to illustrate that. They want to purchase from socially conscious companies. And so companies will present themselves that way in order to attract the majority of young people and their money who are, and they're always the people who are willing to spend the most money. So woke capitalism woke capitalists' branding can therefore harness the propaganda resources of the entire advertising industry to promote progressive causes. And the advertising industry is fine-tuned to such an extent that most people don't realize how propagandistic and how incredibly infiltrating and insidious it is. And that industry is now being used to sometimes blatantly, sometimes subtly promote these progressive causes. And by doing so, they are sending the message that social conservatives and religious traditionalists are the enemy of the public good. So we talk about CNN and the news media, but really the most advanced progressive propagandistic institution is corporate advertising. So how is this enforced? Well, again, it's enforced by surveillance. So we not only have woke capitalism, we also have the rise of surveillance capitalism. Because this politicalization of corporations has occurred at the same time, roughly, that big business has come to understand and embrace the value of amassing vast amounts of personal data. This was originally done as a sales and marketing strategy. You know, if you can learn about what people are searching for online, if you know what their emails are about, if you know what web pages they're looking at, or what they post about on Facebook. If you know these things, you can then sell them things. You know, so that's was the original purpose of gathering all this social data. But of course, that same data can be used to control the populace. So this corporate data harvesting is the bedrock of surveillance capitalism. And where does it come from? Well, a lot of it comes from, quote, smart devices. 70 million Americans, probably more now, have one or more, quote, smart speakers in their home, things like Alexa or Siri. And these devices record all voice commands that they are given. And furthermore, they're always listening. They're always on, because they have to be always on, because they're listening for certain keywords to respond to. So they're always on, they're recording all the commands they're given, and these commands are uploaded to whoever owns that system, whether it's Google or Amazon or whatever. And so every request made of every smart speaker ever is recorded in some database somewhere owned by some corporate mega entity. So essentially, consumerism is how we have learned to love Big Brother. We have not been forced to install telescreens and surveillance bugs in our home. We invited them in. Big Brother is not big government, which is what we expected in the past. We thought it was the government that was going to be totalitarian. Ultimately, big government is big business. Big business monitors every move you make in order to determine how to sell you things. But in order to sell you things, they need to direct your behavior. They need to convince you that you want certain things and you do not want other things. Basically, they have to use propaganda to create and control your opinions and your beliefs. So clearly, this is laying the groundwork. This is the preparation for soft totalitarianism. It's both created and implemented the technology necessary for control. And the technology they can be used to condition the population to accept this level of surveillance and control as normal, as just part of life. So we have surveillance capitalism, in which companies gather detailed information about individuals, and they analyze it with very sophisticated algorithms to predict people's behavior and to predict their opinions. And they do this to sell product, and they do it to make people like what they want them to like. And they do this without people's knowledge or consent. If you know you're being manipulated, you're much harder to manipulate. So their goal is to do this subliminally, to do this without your consent, because that will make you far more susceptible for you to believe what you're told and to buy what you're told. So web browsers, smart speakers, phone apps, virtually every app on your smartphone record almost every aspect of your personal life. They store it and they upload it to the owners of the technology. We've talked about things like Alexa and Siri, but a lot of insurance companies will have an app that if you install it on your phone will give you, refunds based on how safely you drive. Well, they do this by monitoring your position every second of the day. So they can always know where you are. Google Maps does the same thing. Almost every app collects some data on you to some extent or another, and all of that data is uploaded to something else. It's not stored on your phone. Your phone couldn't hold it all. It's all being uploaded to whoever owns the technology. So, as I said, the original purpose of this was just to sell you stuff, which is what you'd expect of a company. But now that companies are beginning to exert their influence over social issues, they are using their surveillance data toward that end as well. Now, the most obvious use of these systems so far for social engineering has been the deplatforming of, quote, undesirable elements by social media, like Facebook and Twitter. Facebook and Twitter will, kick people off if they say they violated their community standards. It's also been used to deny service by financial apps like PayPal. PayPal will no longer work with certain companies if they consider them to be politically undesirable, or even businesses. JP Morgan Chase has refused to do business with certain, quote, far-right organizations. And in many ways, far-right simply means non-woke. In addition, Google has weighted its search results to favor progressive viewpoints in the name of diversity. So you search Google, you will hit the left-wing progressive opinions first and in far larger numbers, even if by their own algorithms, the reverse should be true. Now, this is where it gets tricky. And this is where this big brother is completely different than what people had expected, because these are not government entities. It is not illegal for them to do any of this. It is not illegal for Facebook or Twitter or PayPal to deny their users free speech or to deny services. I mean, most conservatives would say a private business should have the ability to deny service to anyone they want to. So you can't wave the First Amendment in their face because they're not bound by it. They may be very hypocritical that way, but being a hypocrite isn't illegal either. But of course, their enormous penetration into everyday life makes them far more influential than governments. Our government still has limited power. There is very little limiting the power of these giant corporations, which means that their disapproval can be far more damaging. They can completely destroy an opponent's ability to communicate, to get their message out there, to network with other people of similar mind. This isn't to say, of course, that government's just sitting back and doing nothing. Obviously, governments are also working towards this kind of total data gathering. And of course, government groups like the NSA are already, doing their best to record and catalog, say, every cell phone conversation. And ultimately, the government's goal is that your entire digital life should belong to the states. There should be nothing private in your life in digital form. So that ultimately leads to this pink police state scenario that if I remember right, Jeff talked about last week as well. And in the pink police scenario, you don't have overt government oppression, but you have a cooperation between the state and corporations to control their population with digital velvet gloves. They will control their online lives, which will basically be their entire lives, and they will do it in such a way that people will not know that they're being controlled. They will convince them to surrender political liberties for security, but even more so for convenience. Because think of how hard it already is to go without your smartphone, to go without Facebook. It's assumed in modern day society that you have these things, and it's just going to become more so. But to use these is to open yourself up to this level of surveillance. So, has this been achieved already? Yes, it has. And it's happened in China. The system already exists in China. Everything that may sound alarmist and purely as a theoretical possibility that I talked about in the last section, China has now not only implemented, but virtually perfected. China's shown that you can have a wealthy modern society and still be ruthlessly totalitarian. Basically, China utilizes consumer data, biometric information, GPS tracking, facial recognition, DNA, various other forms of data harvesting to administer what they call their social credit system. Basically, they know every aspect of their citizens' lives, and it's all fed in to a computer. And then this program determines who is allowed to buy, to sell, to travel based on their social behavior. And the ultimate goal is to produce an AI, artificial intelligence, powered techno-totalitarian state. Something that has never been seen, never before imagined. Orwell could not have conceived of this level of control. Essentially, they want to manipulate the social behavior and very thoughts of their citizens to such an extent that the people have fully internalized the demands of the state such that compliance comes naturally, without thought, without interference. And they do this by monitoring all their citizens constantly. And they use that to shape their behavior without overt threat. They don't need to threaten the secret police or the gulag. They don't need to create widespread poverty to control their people because they have this social credit system. The social credit system automatically tracks the words and actions of every Chinese citizen, every single one. And it grants rewards or demerits based on their obedience and proper social behavior. You know, if you are overheard spouting Marxist dogma, or if you're helping old ladies across the street, or you're being properly conformist, you'll get your credit score, your social credit score will go up. You'll gain privileges, you'll gain luxuries that aren't available to people with lower scores. if you do something the government disapproves of, your score goes down. You'll be shut out from a lot of opportunities. Your children will not be able to go to the good schools. You will not be able to buy high quality produce or other things. You will not have the advantages that other people do. So this is social engineering on a massive scale. Furthermore, your social credit score will be downgraded even if you associate with offenders, because this encourages social ostracization as further punishment. So essentially, a Chinese citizen cannot participate in the economy or the society without the mark of approval from their leader. They can be completely shut out. Now, the younger Chinese nowadays are so distracted by materialism and shaped by educational propaganda that it would never occur to them to rebel against this. However, because they have such massive data for every citizen, the Chinese government is also engaged in identifying potential rebels, people who might cause problems in the future. They do this through predictive software, again, these very sophisticated algorithms. And the goal is to eliminate these threats before they even realize themselves that they are a threat. They might not have even had a conscious thought of rebellion yet, but the computer has identified them as dangerous. And this is what's happening nowadays in China. So the question is, can it happen here? And the answer is yes. Simple as that. And honestly, I was very tempted to write duh here, because of course, we're not a separate breed of human being from the Russians or the Chinese. There is nothing that happens here that cannot happen here. Now, American culture is at least theoretically more individualistic and more independent-minded. So we might not get the total hard totalitarianism of the Chinese kind, but the apparatus is already there, as you have seen, to create a corporate-driven social credit system of our own, and we're already beginning to see this. You know, people who express the wrong opinions or who make just the wrong slip of the tongue are already being destroyed by social media. And ultimately, there is nothing, no border, no boundary in place to stop necessary but private entities that control access to money and markets from doing things like blackballing individuals, churches, and other organizations that they deem to be bad social actors. And again, we are seeing this already. So the increasing American tendency to forfeit privacy in exchange for security and inconvenience removes the most important barrier to state and corporate control of private life. And this is something that has not gone unnoticed by those who have previously lived under communism. Read the book, that has quotes and stories from people who have lived under communism, who have, raised red flags on this. Because for those under totalitarianism, to live in truth is something that can only be done privately, unless you're just going to completely risk life and limb. However, a life under constant surveillance, the knowledge that everything you say and do is noted and recorded involuntarily changes our behavior. In that situation, nothing we do can be truly truthful. If we know we are always under surveillance, can we ever be honest? Can we ever truly live authentically? And of course, modern social media encourages this inauthentic life. It encourages people not to be themselves, so to present a socially acceptable image of themselves. And ultimately, the irony is that systems that are perceived to connect us more than ever before are actually reproducing the radical isolation and loneliness that before was artificially imposed by totalitarian governments to make people easier to control. Because if the image you present to the world isn't you, if you are not living in truth, you can never make a real connection with another person. Furthermore, by creating a generation habituated to sharing reams of personal data to marketers without thinking twice, social media has made young people highly vulnerable to manipulation and to a westernized version of this Chinese social credit system. So when the system is finally established, Christians are going to have to figure out a new way to live in truth, a new way to live not by lies, in a world in which there will truly be no place to hide. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric. That was really excellent. An awful lot to ponder and seriously consider. Well, let's open things up for questions and relevant comments. And I think for at least the last half of your presentation, I kept coming back to I guess the prayer that should be on all of our minds and all, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. But as we know, Christians under great pressure have been praying Maranatha for 2,000 years. And so, it very well may be that we have to deal seriously with these issues, and not only for the duration of our lifetime, but that of our children and grandchildren as well. So the question is, how shall we then live, to quote a Francis Schaeffer book, for instance. But let's open it up for comments and questions, and anything that you feel like would be relevant to the topic this evening.
I will say something I cut out of my talk for the sake of time, but it's interesting. The whole Chinese social credit system, if you want to see a fictionalized version of that, a perfect example is on a sci-fi television show that most of you have probably never even heard of, called The Orville, which is sort of a Star Trek-like show. But in it, they arrive on a planet where everyone wears badges where they can be up or down voted by anyone around them. And if they do something people don't like, they're downvoted. If you get enough downvotes, you have to go on an apology tour to apologize for your actions. And if you still get too many downvotes, you're basically lobotomized. So it was intended to satirize, social media culture, but it reminded me so strongly of that Chinese social credit system.
Oh my.
If you're interested in watching it, it's on Hulu. The TV show is called The Orville, and the episode is called Majority Rule.
Mm-hmm. Orville, as in, how do you spell that?
As in Orville Wright.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I guess the obvious question that folks would have, and fortunately there's more to the book than just the 2 chapters that you presented, but what to do about all of this? Are there any alternatives to this surveillance culture, this surveillance capitalism that you referred to? And
throw
any
away your cell
alternative?
phone, cancel your Facebook account.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. and our lives will be so complicated as a result, won't they? But anyone have any particular thoughts along those lines? You know, you talked a lot about the tendency that many people have to surrender liberty for the sake of convenience, or for the sake of security. We used to think that it was mostly for security, and that was sort of the thing that we had encountered in Brave New World or 1984 or whatever. But as you rightly pointed out, with the advent, the intrusion of corporate surveillance, you know, woke capitalism, it looks like it's more a matter oftentimes of surrendering liberty for convenience rather than just, you know, outright fear of the government. So what do we make of that? And how shall we then live, given the realities of the situation?
I mean, like I said, it's, you know, to get away from it, throw away your cell phone, close out Facebook, Twitter, all that. The problem is modern society has become structured to assume you have those things.
Yes.
You almost cannot function without at least a cell phone.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. So any thoughts anyone has on that? Now, one issue you brought up that I would take exception to perhaps is the idea that younger Americans believe in absolute truths, that postmodernism has run its course and it's been found to be deficient and frankly irrational and absurd. But I think the issue is more, it's not so much that people have no belief system in truth, but rather we prefer to relativize truth when it suits our own agenda. And so the left will certainly stand up for certain values and principles that they believe are absolute truth. But then they will, of course, claim that, for instance, issues related to human sexuality and so on, that all that's relative. So I think it's more selective relativism, wouldn't you say, than an outright rejection of relativism?
Well, yeah, but they'll say that that relativism in sexuality is absolute. You're not allowed to disagree that sexuality is relative. I mean, as I mentioned, there's a very strong commitment to ideological purity, and that requires unthinking acceptance of some axioms as absolute.
Well, I think relativism is always qualified, and there's always going to be, even those who purport to be relativists, moral relativists, there's always going to be certain things that they take a stand on, as you did point out there. Okay. Right.
I'd like to introduce one word here.
Yes.
This is D. Gregory. And woke, it seems to me like at the beginning of chapter 4, when Eric was talking, if I got this correct, that woke capitalism leads to a socialist personality, which leads to a social media personality. And the word I wanted to introduce was that I heard last week was influencer. On social media, our young people are being mesmerized and hypnotized and so drawn into the social media personality that there are influencers that are far apart from what we have brought our children up to believe and our grandchildren up to believe. It's like the social media personality is sweeping through the minds of so many of our young people. Does that word influencer make any sense?
Yeah, Eric, you're muted right now.
Yeah, for some reason my space bar wasn't working. But yeah, I mean, those are the influencers are some of the main drivers in all this, because so many of those influencers are oppressed groups. They're, gay or trans or something like that. So they use their, position to forward this kind of ideology, and that's social media personality. The socialist personality was what the old communist regimes were trying to create, which was the person who's always, spying on his neighbors. But the social media personality is the one that doesn't need to be spied on. They're putting everything about themselves out there already, and they don't see the point of privacy at all.
And what an incredible challenge to parents today.
Absolutely.
Oh my, I cannot
Absolutely.
imagine. I just absolutely cannot imagine. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Dee?
No, it just, yeah, it's just difficult, like you said, for parents to be able to monitor that when their child is an influencer. To control it is like impossible. It seems like.
Well, this obviously, what I'm going to say is easier said than done, and that is a basic theme of this book, and we talked about it a bit last week as well, is authentic, true Christianity by its very nature countercultural? And I believe it absolutely is. I mean, I think Scripture is very clear on the issue.
Will you say that one more time, please?
It is authentic, true Christianity innately, by its nature, countercultural. And I think too long, of course, because of our unique American heritage and history, for too long, we've thought that our society and culture generally is supportive of our values and beliefs and priorities. We realize, of course, that that has eroded a lot in recent decades, but I think there's still an awful lot of Christians who function under the illusion that our basic social structures and institutions, our systems, are generally supportive of our values and worldviews. I think that clearly is untrue anymore. That being the case, again, we are facing challenges that no previous generation in Christian history has had to contend with. And I think we need to be in the forefront of these issues, because churches generally are avoiding all these matters. In fact, too many churches, too many pastors and church leaders will not address anything that is deemed controversial, which means they would avoid this book like the plague. But we realize that we have a high calling in Christ, and we are to stand for biblical values regardless of the cost. The question is, a lot of this has totally surprised us and has caught us totally unprepared. So how do we deal with these vast changes?
And you are specifically talking about, protecting children, and it's virtually impossible. Even if you completely control everything they see or hear at home, their friends will show it to them at school. Their friends will show them to it at church.
Mm-hmm.
You'd have to have them under such rigid barriers that they basically would be cut off from the entire world around them. It's virtually, you can't shield them completely from all of this.
And of course, we would not want to do that. We wouldn't want to cloister them. Of course, it's a matter of preparing them to be able to deal with the great challenges they're going to face in terms of their teachers at school, regardless of whether it's a public school or a private school. Most private schools are every bit as bad as public schools when it comes to these kind of issues. In fact, a lot of schools that proclaim themselves to be, quote, Christian schools never address these issues either, and many of them have totally caved in to the woke agenda. So Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, the previous book, was much criticized for advocating that Christians retreat from society. But we brought him in for a forum 3 years ago, and I talked a lot to him about this. He's also given a lot of interviews in which he's made it very clear that that's not his agenda at all. Christians should not isolate themselves from mainstream society. But what he does advocate very strongly is churches need to be strengthened. And, you know, if you cannot find a strong support group, you know, within your church, then look outside your church for other Christians who take their faith seriously and really want to deal with and confront some of these issues that face us. Now, I realize that a lot in this book and a lot that we're talking about over these several weeks would lead a lot of people to the conclusion that this is too pessimistic. Now, frankly, the issue is not whether something is optimistic or pessimistic. What matters is it realistic? That's what matters. And God will give us the grace, and God will give us the wisdom to navigate through some of the most difficult issues in life. But we have to be rooted in realism and not some kind of false, phony optimism, or for that matter, unnecessary, unwarranted, you know, negativity as well, pessimism. So it's quite a challenge. And again, these are things that ought to be discussed on a regular basis in our churches, but they are not. But maybe we can be a source of, you know, enlightenment in our own situation when it comes to our particular church or our particular Christian group that we associate with. Eric, you pointed out.
Let
that,
me make one statement. Don
please.
Jacobson.
Yes, please do.
Peace is not the absence of conflict.
Right. Absolutely. Good point. Go ahead, if you will, and just kind of, you know, unpack that for us, if you will.
I really didn't expect to do that, but there's no way you can address all these issues without some sort of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't have peace
Mm-hmm.
and not challenge a culture, put it that way.
Right. And we have a perfect example of someone who did just that in Jesus Christ. So as in everything, he is our model, our exemplar. Mm-hmm. Eric, just a couple more things, and then we'll kind of cut things off. You talked about how neo-Marxism or progressivism, or whatever term they want to hide behind, it's basically a surrogate religion. It's anti-Christ, it's anti-God, and yet it has borrowed a lot from Christianity in the past. Karl Marx did, despite his hatred of God. And so a lot of this social justice agenda is basically a perversion, as you pointed out. It's a perversion of Christian ideals. In particular, one core Christian ideal, which is also a core ideal of natural moral law, and that is the idea of the common good. But I think oftentimes as Christians, we don't emphasize enough that the Bible is a profound treatise on social justice. The Old Testament's full of it, and the New Testament includes a lot of this as well. But biblical social justice is absolutely antithetical to this atheistic pseudo-social justice that we're being flooded with in our society and culture today. Anything you'd like to comment on that? And then if there's no more comments or questions, we'll sort of close things out.
Well, as I said, I mean, the the starting point, the thing that ultimately makes the difference is the Christian assertion that all have sinned, and that being poor doesn't protect you from sin, being rich doesn't protect you from sin, being white, being black, none of these things protect you from being a sinner. That we're all sinned, we're all guilty, and being a member of some group or another doesn't make you inherently more sinful or inherently less sinful than any others. And that's the key difference, because the sort of modern woke social justice presumes that that the ones in power are automatically sinful and the ones not in power are automatically pure. And that ends up leading to a warped ideology, because again, the people who are, even if they are being oppressed, which, you can't say that there's no oppression of any kind going on, but that leads, being oppressed just tends you toward a different set of sins than being in power does. It doesn't make you less sinful. It just means you have a different set of sins to choose from. It doesn't mean you're inherently more moral. It just means you're not immoral in the way that others might be. And so that's the big difference. Christians know that everyone is a sinner, that we should always be looking to remove the plank from our own eye first before trying to accuse others of the speck in theirs.
Well, we're all created as individuals in the image of God, and we will be judged as individuals, not according to our group identity. And you're quite right about that. And that's one of the major fallacies in this whole progressive social justice facade, is that people are automatically categorized and either accepted or dismissed according to absurd identity stereotypes. So very much looking forward to Larry Keener's presentation next week. And so please join us then. And unless there's any other thoughts, any other comments, we'll just close things out for tonight. Thank you for being with us. And again, Eric, thank you. Excellent presentation.
The person I thought was smiling at us, it was just a picture of him up there. Some people just put a picture.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so
Yes,
much.
Thanks for being with us. Perrin, nice to see you. And Jack and Barbara, good to see you all from South Carolina. Pardon me? Up a ways?
Yes, Greenville, South Carolina.
Okay, Greenville. Okay. All right. Very good. Well, sure good to see you all.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank
Good
you, Eric.
presentation.
Yeah. Blessings on your week.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Perrin.
Bye. Bye, Daddy.
Bye, parent. I'll see you tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
I love you.
That's
I love you, Andrea.
Love you too.
Aw, too sweet.
All right.
We're
Well, this love
we're on
fest is
we're on
ending.
yes, we're on a trip right now, so we're not at home with Eric.
I know.
So,
Okay.
all right. Good
Well, enjoy.
night. Okay.
Because it's my grandparents' 50th anniversary.
Yeah. We're gonna use it.
Oh, 50th.
15th.
Oh.
Oh, grandparents 50th. Yeah. There's the cat. Look at that.
Bye. Thank you.